And good morning, church. It's good to see you all today, and I just want to welcome you again to worship here at Lafayette. It's so good to have you with us, especially again if you are visiting with us this morning, joining us online. It's great to have you be a part of our worship this morning, and I'm excited for the rest of our time together today. We're going to be having our seventh message in this series about community and friendship and relationships. And then toward the end of our service today, we're going to be celebrating a baptism together, which is not the worst way to conclude a message, I think. So we can be looking forward to that as well. So 2 Sundays from now, which is August 2nd, we're going to have our final message in this series that we've been focused on most of the summer. And I've mentioned this a couple times. I've never done this before, but I had been asked about this by a few of you. So we're going to do kind of a Q&R type of sermon, and I've already said I don't know if this is going to work, so we're just going to kind of see for one Sunday. So this is kind of what I need from you, or what I would like from you. You've been listening to what I have laid out for you, a theology of community. You've heard scriptures, you've heard theological arguments, you've heard different practical applications. And so the idea here is that as you think about scriptures that we've already explored that you might have more questions about, or other things we might have left out, as you think about sort of your theology of some of this or just certain practical applications, basically I'm wanting us to take some time to explore further questions you might have, especially ones that you think the wider congregation might benefit from. So I've gotten 2 submissions so far that I'll just offer to you by way of example. This will be the sermon in 2 weeks if I don't hear from anybody else. So I don't really know if I'm going to get 3 of these or 15 of these or how we'll handle that. But basically, you can text or email me by the end of next Sunday. We'll go from there. But these are the 2 that have come in to give you kind of a taste. The first one, someone asked, I reworded this a little bit, but this was the heart of the question. How are we called as Christians to approach what we might call toxic relationships? Even within our earthly families or within our church families. So that makes sense to me as a follow-up question. This hasn't been hunky-dory, but we've kind of presumed that relationships are easy and we all kind of share this beautiful calling together. So I could see that being something well worth our time, kind of spending a little bit more time talking about, okay, so what happens if we're in community with people and relationships where these things are not so easy? So that'll be one we'll look at. And then the second one was, given what we have studied on the importance of community, how should a church like Lafayette view things in our modern day setting like virtual worship? That was actually word for word. I hear that person asking, how do we account for all of this virtual stuff in 2026 as it pertains to community? So that's also something I think that would be good to spend some time on. So if you have a thought, if you have a question, something we could explore further, again, text or email me by the end of next Sunday, and we'll see where that takes us in 2 weeks. Today, we are going to be focused on basically another, you guys know how I like to think about this, another balance or another tension that we kind of experience in the scriptures, especially in our relationships between fellow believers on the one hand, and in our relationships with folks who do not share our Christian faith. So if you think about much of this series, we've been talking a lot about all of this one another language that exists in the scriptures. And that one another language kind of presumes that we're talking to groups of fellow Christians who all actually agree and accept all of this teaching. So you all go and treat each other like this. And that's because the teaching of Jesus, the teachings of Scripture are accepted by these people who proclaim Christ as Lord. And much of the conversation that we've had so far about community has been about explicitly Christian community. We've been using that, the Greek word for fellowship, that word koinonia that you've heard me say several times. Well, that's a Christian word. That is a word that describes the Christian mutual fellowship that is shared between brothers and sisters in Christ. So that we've been a little bit more focused on like Christian to Christian community and relationships and friendship. And so as we broaden our horizon of community and of relationships and friendship, we all pretty quickly realize that we all have friends, we all have community, we all have relationships in this life, even very meaningful ones, that do not share our common foundation of Jesus. And so perhaps we don't approach those relationships the very same way with the very same one another teachings that we would with all of this other stuff. We all very likely have members of our own, I call them earthly families, who do not claim the lordship of Christ in their life. Probably immediate family members of yours, if not, certainly extended family members of yours who you are in community with. You're right. You're called to be in relationship with them, but there's not that common foundation of Jesus. And clearly, my advice this morning is not going to be to just separate yourself fully from all of those people. Right? We all have close friends as we go out into the world, into our workplaces, into our schools, into like our literal neighborhoods where we live near people. As we just go out into our broader community, our broader city, we are, of course, in our current context, surrounded by folks who do not necessarily share all of this common Christian foundation. And that does not mean we're never called to be in relationship with these people. And so this is kind of the balance or the tension I want us to navigate today. We've established how we handle our relationships with one another, but how do we also incorporate and what wisdom is there as we approach relationships with our non-Christian friends? There's technically a phrase that I feel like when I was growing up in Sunday school, this is just how we always handled that tension or that balance. I was just always told, well, we're in the world, but not of the world. Of course, a lot of you guys have probably heard that. I thought, that sounds so biblical. I thought it was a Bible verse until I was like 25, I think. It's actually not a Bible verse. It's kind of a made-up Bible verse. It's a synthesis, obviously, of a lot of Bible ideas. And probably the closest phrase that it's drawing from, or the closest passage, is in John 17. John 17 is where Jesus is praying for his disciples. And kind of listen to his language here. Again, this is him praying for us and about our relationship as disciples of Jesus, as Christians, to the wider world where Christianity is not taken for granted. And this is the wisdom he gives us, and I think this is where we kind of draw that phrase from. So he says, for they, his disciples, are not of the world any more than I am of the world, Jesus says. My prayer, though, is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. And so Jesus introduces, again, this balance where we're not really of the world and we don't truly belong here, but Jesus' prayer is not that we would just be entirely removed from the world around us where not everybody is a disciple of Jesus. And so he introduces this balance through the form of a prayer. And I think all of our well-intended Sunday school teachers who are saying, well, we're called to be in the world, but not of the world. This is kind of the basic passage and the basic thought process they're drawing from. And so I think we can all acknowledge that we are, to some extent, maybe to some large extent, that we are in community with people who are not fellow believers. I'm sheltered from this like a little bit more than most of you, and that my vocation is generally to interact with fellow Christians, although of course not fully. That's not the only way I should be spending my time. But all of us in our context, between our families, our friends, all of our different circles, we probably feel this tension between perhaps what we've talked about this summer, this a theology of community and all these Christian relationships we're supposed to be engaging in. But then if you were here last summer, remember we talked about a theology of mission. And we were a lot more focused on the call that the church shares to go out into the world on mission for God. So there is this balance or this tension we might all feel between community on the one hand and mission. Am I supposed to just be doing churchy stuff all the time with all the church people? Or am I supposed to be out in the world, reaching the lost and being out in the darkness, so to speak, but being a light in the world? And you kind of have that back and forth feeling. So before we get into a couple of passages that I think address this in a very interesting way, and I think even in a challenging way, there's one more set of language that I want not really to introduce, but to remind many of you of this language that I think is helpful as we imagine this back and forth. So when Bob Clark was our minister for many years, Bob and thus all of us, we often emphasized the pairing of these two words that you see up on there, gathering and scattering. And you're still familiar with that language, most likely from, that's still kind of embedded in the emails that we send out every week, the gathering, the scattering, the middle. And so we still use some of this, but I found that pairing was really helpful for me personally in my journey, but also I think it's a helpful pairing for a church to remind ourselves of kind of the basic in and out rhythm or the in and out flow of congregational life. That you probably hear me talk more about like fellowship and mission, but another way to say that is like on the one hand you have the gathering and the time that we spend together with fellow Christians and all the worship we do and the service we do together, but then there is the scattering and there's the mission and there's the call the church has out into the world. And if you think about it, let's kind of pretend these were two extremes. And frankly, nobody's at either extreme, but let's just kind of imagine that. Were Christians to only gather? Were we to only emphasize, okay, let's spend time around fellow Christians, let's spend all of our time studying together and worshiping together and edifying each other and building each other up, then we would have a really strong internal fellowship. But over time, that internal fellowship would probably start to feel a little insular or a little closed off from our wider mission. We might even start to become kind of fearful of the wider world around us and all the darkness that is out there. And so that's kind of one extreme. It would be to gather so much that you're not doing enough scattering. Now, I think we probably have a lot of leeway here in that as we read the Acts chapter 2 passage that we explored, we learned that the early church was gathering together daily, and that did not seem to be too much for them. Like, oh, there's just too much community going on, there's too much fellowship. So don't hear me too much on this point, because I think we as modern people probably have a lot of way to go before we would have too much Christian influence in our life. But certainly there is kind of like a hypothetical situation where you could gather so much that you forget your call to scatter. And the opposite is true as well. And this is really the warnings in our passages, the second passage in particular this morning, are going to kind of provide an indirect warning about what it would look like if we're all scattering and no gathering, right? All the way out in the world and forming relationships with non-Christians and putting ourselves in position to influence people and win people for Christ and all that sort of thing. But then the question becomes, well, can we actually keep our distinctiveness? Can a Christian be out in the world and still be a Christian without also withdrawing to spend time with fellow disciples and to spend time building up one's faith? Can our faith remain strong enough? Can our loyalty to Jesus and the ways of Jesus remain strong enough if we don't also have that rhythm of gathering and not only scattering? So we could probably see that as kind of a caricature of both extremes. Both extremes would lead to some real challenges, and we would have a very imbalanced faith between the gathering and the scattering and the fellowship and the mission. And Bob would always kind of tell me, because back in the day I would get frustrated with some of you guys, believe it or not, and Bob would kind of tell me, he would say, well, in any church I've ever worked in, you have folks that kind of lean one of these directions and folks that lean the other direction, and there's some natural frustrations there. But we just want to make sure no one leans so far one direction that they stumble and fall. Okay, so that's kind of the idea, right? Is that some of us may be a little bit more wired towards that gathering mentality and that edification among fellow believers. And folks like that need to remember, oh yeah, this isn't just about me and us and our Christian group. There is a world out there. We are called out into the world. And others, maybe from some of the passage we'll hear today, need to give some clear thought to, okay, yes, I'm out in the world. I have relationships with all sorts of people, but am I gathering enough? Am I withdrawing enough? Am I spending enough time with Jesus and the people of Jesus to actually keep my distinctive identity as a family member of Jesus Christ? So that's the balance we'll walk today here for a few minutes. So let's begin in Galatians 6. We're not going at hyperspeed today, but I could belabor all of this more than I'm going to choose to. So this is Galatians chapter 6. This is a little bit later in the same passage that talks about bearing each other's burdens. Thereby you fulfill the law of Christ. That's verse 2. That's where we began the series. So now we're in verse 9, and Paul's giving further exhortation. And he says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. And then he says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. Okay, but then he says, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So first of all, this is just kind of a bonus, but verse 9 there is one of these let us statements, let us statements, and it's a beautiful one. It's kind of apart from the point of this morning in this series, but this call here, let us not become weary in doing good. I think that's just a beautiful encouragement that we might all need to hear in our walks with Jesus, in our walks alongside the Lord's people, or even out in the world. That just, for me, is a really helpful reminder. But more to the point of what I want you to see here, it comes in verse 10. He's established this idea of let us keep doing good. Let us not grow weary in doing good. But then he sort of qualifies or categorizes all of that doing good. So he says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. And I think by that he means all people. All people means all people. But he says, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. And so hear me say this morning that Paul is calling all Christians to do all sorts of good for all sorts of people. There is no license here for us to ignore anybody out in the world. There's no license for us here to treat people poorly or to say, well, I love these people, but I love the family of God, but I don't love everybody else. Because he's point blank saying, well, we're going to do good to all people. And let us not grow weary of doing good to all people. But he also introduces that there is this special duty, there is this special responsibility, he says, for Christians to especially do good, to especially take care of their fellow family of believers, a.k.a. God's people, a.k.a. the church. And so he establishes kind of what I see here as a pairing of how we're to treat everybody, but then within that, how we are especially to treat and share a certain type of special relationship with fellow brothers and sisters. So I don't want that to be a proof text, but I just want to put that in front of you as like a way to kind of imagine treating everybody a certain way, but then having a special relationship. So now let's go to 2 Corinthians 6. This is the passage that'll push us a little bit more, but also I think gives us some of the more robust wisdom as it pertains to how we can approach our relationships with people who do not share our faith. So this is a pretty famous verse here, verse 14. It reads, in the NIV, it reads, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. So again, that's the NIV. I've thrown up 3 other translations there. You can kind of poke around on those as you look at those and see the differences. But the more classic translations or the more literal translations use a phrase that may be a little bit more familiar to some of you. And it's this command. It says to not be unequally yoked. And I think that phrase actually is a lot better. It captures the heart of the idea here. So let me talk about this just for a second. I think you'll see the point pretty quickly. So this comes from an interesting word that is used only here in the New Testament. We have nothing else to compare it to. And it's a word that is really 2 words smushed together. And one of the words is the word for a yoke. And a yoke is sort of like a wooden beam or a bar that would connect 2 animals together to allow those animals to pull a heavier weight. So you have 2 animals that could carry a certain amount each themselves. You put a yoke on top of them, and it allows those 2 animals to carry more weight than they otherwise could by themselves. And so this word yoke does show up several times in the New Testament. But it's smushed together with the word heteros that we use all the times in our language to refer to something that is different or other. And so the literal command here is to not be yoked, sort of using this metaphor, to not be yoked to another type of something. And so I need to unpack that a little bit. This is actually all coming from a weird sort of, I shouldn't call the Bible weird probably, but it's coming from a strange passage in Deuteronomy 22 where there's a couple of quick commands about basically not yoking together different types of animals. Like you can kind of see, I mean, this is just like a cartoon, I guess, but you have, that'd be a donkey and a bull, right? Now I'm afraid to say that out loud because I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong animals. But you have 2 different types of animals, right? Well, that's not really how the yoke is designed there, because that is actually probably going to make things worse. That bigger animal is going to have a worse time carrying a load because he's got this little donkey alongside of him. And so there's a passage in Deuteronomy 22 that talks about different animals, different seeds, different types of linen. And basically what we think Paul is doing is he's just assuming we kind of know all of that. And the reason I'm explaining it is because I don't think we probably know all that. I think we probably need to kind of understand the metaphor more. But he's saying, okay, listen to all that. Here's the metaphor. I don't want you all as Christians to be unequally yoked, to connect your yoke to another. And that another, in this instance, we realize, has nothing to do with animals. It has nothing to do with seeds or types of linen. He's giving us a metaphor for the relationship that Christians are called to have with non-Christians, or that believers are to have with unbelievers. And so he's giving us some advice here, some wisdom. He's actually giving us a command to be very cautious with the type of relationship that we enter into with unbelievers, which I know sounds a little hardcore at first, but let's kind of unpack it a little bit more. So if you are familiar with this, it is probably because this has historically been used as like, what does this get applied to? This gets applied to marriage, right? This is kind of the main way you've heard it. It's used as kind of a specific advice that a Christian ought to be careful about entering into marriage with a non-Christian. Now, I'm not saying that's not a good application of this. I'm just saying this passage is not talking about marriage at all, technically. Again, that would be an application, but I think this is actually a much broader, a much more general teaching, a much more general point of wisdom that isn't just about a husband and a wife or close friends, but it's just giving Christians a general principle and a command to consider that we ought to be cautious, we ought to be wise as it pertains to the relationships that we have with non-believers, and making sure that we're not entering into this sort of unequal yoke relationship. So he says that in verse 14, and then the rest of the passage really is just, it's almost like Paul knows he said something a little strong there, and then the rest of the passage is him kind of making a case for what he's already said. So I'll just kind of point this out to you, and then I think you'll get the point if you don't have it already from what he says to follow. So he gives a command, and then he's going to raise 5 questions here. 5 rhetorical questions. Really, they're all the same question. And then if those 5 questions didn't convince you, then he gives 3 passages. So he's a Bible guy. He goes, here's 5 questions to consider. Here's 3 passages to consider from the Old Testament. But all of this is really just saying, hey, don't just completely blow off the world around you. You're gonna be out in the world. You're gonna have relationships out in the world. But let us be wise and discerning about the types of partnerships, the type of relationships that we enter into and maintain with people who do not share that common foundation of Jesus. So these are the questions he asks. Again, a bit hardcore, but he says, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? And then he says basically the same thing 4 more times. Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? And then he says, for we are the temple of the living God. And then he goes into these 3 other passages from drawing from 5 different Old Testament passages that are basically making the point about we are, the church is the place where God's Spirit dwells, and where we are called to be holy, and where we are called to be in a special bond with each other and with God. And so we have to be careful about what sort of communion we share with others who don't have that foundation. So again, it feels a little hardcore for us, but I think it's really helpful for me at least to remember that he is writing to the Corinthians here. We're studying 1 Corinthians on Wednesday night, so those that have been over there, this will make a lot of sense. But it would be helpful to remember that he is writing to people who were very recently pagans, like they were literal pagans. This reference to the temple of God versus the temple of idols, this isn't an incidental reference. These are people who just a few years ago worshiped in temples of idols and lived in a pagan culture where there was a lot of things taken for granted as being okay that are no longer okay for those within the family of God. And so Paul is writing to a group of people who are struggling to develop and maintain the mind of Christ that 1 Corinthians 2 talks about, while still living in a world where the mind of Christ is not taken for granted. And so what's happening is there are worldly ways of thinking, worldly ways of living that are slowly but surely creeping back into the church. And so I think Paul fully recognizes that these Corinthians that have been converted to the way of Jesus and are now trying to follow Jesus sincerely, that they're doing that, but they also go out into the world where it's really difficult. It's the gathering and the scattering, right? They go out into a culture They go out onto a context where none of these values are shared. None of these ways of life are common. And so these people are kind of caught in between their old way of life and their new way of life. And I don't hear Paul saying, cut off your old world entirely. In fact, I know that because in 1 Corinthians 7, he even tells a husband and a wife where one person is a believer, one person is not a believer. He doesn't want those two people to split. So I think Paul would have us be faithful in our relationships with all non-believers, in our families, close friends we have, in our wider community. But he's trying to help us remember our distinctions, the common call that we share as believers to live lives of holiness, to be a place where God's Spirit is present and palpable. And I think he has some very real pastoral concerns about the way that his group is kind of existing in that world, out in the world, and then also here within the church. And this is basically what Jesus prayed for, right? He said, I don't want you to take them out of the world, but I want you to protect them from the dangers that these disciples of mine are going to face inevitably, no matter what the century is, no matter what the cultural context is, as they try to gather and be a community, but as they also go out on mission into the world and they live out their faith in the world. So for me, this passage just really kind of captures some of the tensions you likely feel. I know saying, what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? That feels very black and white in its thinking to us, I know, but I really think it makes a lot of sense as you think about Paul's original context and still our context. And I know for me across my spiritual journey, this has been a tension I experience. I feel like you guys probably should feel it even more, that you feel that call to community and a certain type of lifestyle within the church, within God's people, and yet you recognize that your life is out there and you're out in the world. And so how do we approach all of those different things? So I want to land this by telling you real quickly here about a book that helped me out a few years ago. So there was a stretch of time kind of in college into my early time here at Lafayette where I was really wrestling with, I already had the feeling of like, okay, the mission of the church is really important, but I was coming to develop this vision more for the importance of Christian community, and I couldn't really piece those things together because it felt like I was choosing. I'm like, are we supposed to be on mission, or are we supposed to be a certain type of community? Is it the gathering, or is it the scattering? So Bob kind of helped me say it's both of those things. There were days I felt like I wanted to go be a missionary overseas, and there were days I felt like I wanted to be a monk who just like withdrew into isolation and ignored the wider world and just prayed and ate and read my Bible all day and did some dishes and grew some vegetables. And that sounded great. And I'm like, so how do we marry the biblical visions of missionary and monk? Are there some ways that we can be a community, a legitimate community that has distinctions and has a common life together, but not become so isolated that we forget about the world around us? So there was this little book I came across. It was in grad school. It was assigned to me. But my understanding is this is not a very popular book. This is pretty obscure. It was written by a little German guy named Gerhard Lofink. I actually don't know if he's a little German guy, but he's a German guy. He's a German guy. He may or may not be little. I don't know what he looks like. But it was written by a German guy. It's a little book. That's probably what I was thinking. And it's called simply Jesus and Community. And what this book helped me do is it looked at Jesus, and it looked at his life, and it looked at the way he carried himself in his mission, especially in the 3 years of ministry, but his time on earth. And it helped for me kind of marry or bring together both the community and the mission. That this isn't like a choice we're making. Are we going to be Christians who bless those outside of our church and do good to them? Or are we going to be one another Christians? But it gave me a vision for how Jesus himself was not ashamed to be in community with fellow disciples and to do all this one another stuff and to say, if you know how God has loved you, you all better go love one another. And to have that real strong call to Christian community, but then to allow that community to flow out into a sense of mission. And so I'm not saying just everybody go read this book because it's been a few years. It may stink. I don't know. It may just be the book I needed at the time. But for me, I think there is a way to look at the life of Jesus and to look at just our rhythm and our flow of the local church and see how both of these things are so important. If it's all community and no mission, we're going to be missing something. If it's all mission and no community, you're going to be missing something. And you might find that it's hard to sustain that mission without that wider belonging within the people of God. And so for me, this has been a journey. I believe we're called to not be unequally yoked to unbelievers, but I also believe we're called to be a city on a hill and a light to the world and the salt of the earth. And I don't think we can do all those things if we cut off all of our non-Christian relationships. So there's a tension here. And this is how our little German friend put it. I'll give you one quote here. He says, "The world can be changed only when the people of God itself changes. It is not possible to liberate others unless freedom radiates within one's own group." I'd love you to think about that sentence for a while. It is not possible to preach repentance to others, to the world, to those outside of the church, unless one lives in a community which takes seriously the new society of the reign of God. And again, that's just a little snippet of how he brings both of these things together. As I mentioned earlier, we get to conclude today with one of the better sermon conclusions, which is to share in a time of baptism, which is really just provides a neat connection to so much of what we've been talking about this morning and even throughout the summer. Many of you have come to know Beth Doris over the last several months, 6-8 months, something like that. And Beth was so excited to have so many of her family members with her. We're here today, so it's a blessing to have you guys. But Beth has been journeying with us here at Lafayette for some time now, and of course, like everybody else, Beth has her own unique life story, her own unique spiritual journey that she's been on for many years. But it's been such a blessing for Lafayette to walk alongside of her in the recent months and to come to know her. And if you haven't come to do that, this morning's a good opportunity. But we're so blessed this morning for Beth to make this decision to put on Christ in baptism and to dedicate and mark just a turning point in her life. And as we've talked about, not just alongside the brothers and sisters at Lafayette, but a baptism into the Big C Church, right? A call to follow Jesus, to put on Jesus, and to begin to walk alongside of God's people. So I want to, before we do this, we'll sing and do a couple things here still, but I want to conclude this morning with just reading the same passage we concluded with last Sunday, and I think it'll make sense to you why we're doing this. So we'll read this for in a second from 1 Corinthians 12, and then just to give you a little feel for what we're going to do here, we're still going to stand and sing, sharing a time of singing here as we get ready. And then we'll have Beth's baptism. And then I think we're going to say probably, for the most part, just kind of stay where you are, because if 50 of you come right here, then the other 75 of you won't be able to see anything. But we'll kind of sit here and support Beth in this moment. And then at some point along the way, Colby's going to circle us up for a final song, and we're going to pray together, close out our service that way. So this is 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. It connects so well to what we've been talking about with community, but also this celebration that we're about to witness. Paul says, "Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many." What a beautiful passage that is. And at this time, let's stand and let's sing together.